My brother's wife faked an entire pregnancy and tricked our whole family into believing it. But when I started asking questions, the truth destroyed everything. Alright, so here's the deal. I, 22F, have an older brother, John, 32M, who's been with his fiancée, Jane, 30F, for 4 years. They recently had a baby, and while you'd think this would be a heartwarming family moment, let me tell you, something about the entire pregnancy just didn't sit right. And now, they're demanding an apology just because I dared to ask a few questions. It all started when Jane found out she was pregnant at 5.5 weeks. She called my mom right away, absolutely over the moon. My mom was thrilled too, of course, but also a little confused. 5 weeks seemed pretty early to announce it, but hey, to each their own. A few hours later, Jane called again, sobbing hysterically. She claimed she was having insatiable cravings and couldn't control herself. My mom, trying to lighten the mood, joked, "Isn't it a bit early for cravings?" And that's when Jane completely lost it. She snapped at my mom, yelling that this was her pregnancy and no one else's. It was weird. And then, like flipping a switch, she apologized, blaming it on hormones. Red flag? Maybe. Then came the next surprise. When John got back from a work trip, they packed up and moved in with Jane's mom immediately. We didn't see her for the entire pregnancy. John's excuse? Jane was terrified of losing the baby and needed to be with her mom for emotional support. And apparently, we needed to respect boundaries. Okay, sure. But then things got even weirder. Every time someone asked about the pregnancy, we'd get vague, scripted answers like every pregnancy is different, or she's carrying small, which isn't unusual. No ultrasound pictures, no baby shower, no updates, nothing. It was like the pregnancy was happening in some kind of top-secret government facility. And every craving Jane mentioned? Well, I did some digging and found they were listed word for word from an online pregnancy cravings article. Same order, same items. Coincidence? I think not. Finally, after 9 long months, the baby was born and we were finally allowed to see them. It was bittersweet. We were happy, of course, but it felt off. Like we were outsiders looking in. Jane and John kept saying that we helped by staying away, but honestly, it felt more like we'd been completely shut out. But here's where things go from strange to downright bizarre. Jane's version of the birth story didn't make sense at all. She claimed she had an epidural administered through an 4 drip in her hand. If you know anything about childbirth, you'd know that's not how epidurals work. I thought maybe she was just confused. It happens, right? So I gently asked a few clarifying questions. But the second I did, she completely shut down, just like she had during the pregnancy. And then came the biggest shocker. Jane said the baby had latching issues because he was born with no umbilical cord stump. Now, I'm no doctor, but a quick Google search told me that's incredibly rare and often fatal. Yet here their baby was, perfectly healthy, no sign of any medical complications. Still not weird enough? How about this? Jane told us that the baby basically fell out of her within an hour of labor, like it was the easiest thing ever. But John? He said it was the hardest thing they'd ever been through, which is why they weren't planning to have any more kids. Huh? The contradictions were piling up fast. My mom and I have been quietly comparing notes, both of us realizing these inconsistencies just don't add up. But we're at a loss about how to bring it up without causing a major fallout. And believe me, their reactions aren't helping. A few days ago, things came to a head. My brother sent my mom a long text, basically accusing us of being disrespectful and saying we owe Jane a full apology for bullying her about the pregnancy and labor. Hold up. Bullying? All I did was ask a couple of innocent questions that any normal person might ask. It's not like I accused her of faking the whole thing, though, let's be honest, it's getting hard not to wonder. Now, I'm left wondering, am I the butthole for having doubts? Because if this were anyone else's pregnancy, I'd let it go. But the whole thing feels too weird to ignore. Update 1. I decided to tread lightly and bring up Jane's birth story again, just casually in conversation with John. I figured if I approached it as if I was just curious, maybe he'd clarify some things and put my doubts to rest. Instead, he got super defensive and shut it down immediately, saying Jane doesn't owe anyone a detailed play-by-play of the most personal experience of her life. That part one could understand, but then he added, besides, she's still processing everything. Processing what exactly? I thought the baby basically fell out of her in under an hour. A week passed, and things took another weird turn. My mom made an innocent comment about how the baby's complexion looked different from Jane's side of the family. It wasn't meant as anything more than a passing observation, but Jane went completely silent. The energy in the room shifted, and John quickly changed the subject. Later that night, Mom texted me saying she couldn't shake the feeling that something just wasn't right. That's when we started comparing notes, and let me tell you, the list of inconsistencies grew fast. We realized that Jane's timeline of symptoms and cravings lined up too perfectly with generic pregnancy articles. Even little details, like the way she described morning sickness hitting exactly at 6 weeks on the dot, seemed oddly textbook. I went back to that article where I first noticed the suspicious cravings, and sure enough, everything she claimed she was experiencing appeared in the exact same order, down to the sudden craving for citrus followed by an aversion to coffee. The birth story itself kept changing every time she told it. First, she said labor was so fast that the doctors barely made it in time, but later, she told my aunt it was a grueling 12-hour experience. Then there's the whole epidural thing. I casually asked about the 4-drip in her hand again, hoping she'd clarify or maybe laugh it off as a mix-up, but instead, she just got this blank look and said, "You wouldn't understand unless you've had one." Okay, sure, but I know enough to know that's not how epidurals work. Then there was the hospital visit. My cousin, who works in admin at the hospital where Jane claimed to have given birth, said she couldn't find any records under Jane's name. Of course, privacy laws exist, but it just added to the growing suspicion. Jane insisted they had a special arrangement because of how anxious she was about privacy, but I've never heard of hospitals keeping everything that secretive. Even celebrities get spotted coming in and out. Things took an even weirder turn when Jane started dodging baby-related questions from family. My grandma, who had 6 kids of her own, asked if she was breastfeeding, and Jane just said, "We're doing what's best for us," without elaborating. Later, we found out from John that the baby was on formula because of the latching issues Jane had mentioned before. But then Jane told my mom she was exclusively pumping because the baby was a champ at feeding. Which is it? At this point, Mom and I weren't the only ones noticing the weirdness. My aunt asked if Jane was planning to join a mom's group in the area, and Jane completely froze up, then mumbled something about being too busy. A few days later, Mom found out that Jane had joined a mom group, but it was all online. No in-person meetups, no actual contact with other moms, just lurking and posting generic comments about how hard but rewarding motherhood is. It was all so vague and impersonal, almost like she was copying things other people said. Then came the baptism fiasco. My family is pretty religious, and we were all excited for the baby's baptism, but Jane suddenly said they weren't ready and needed more time to plan. Again, fair enough, but then my brother slipped up and mentioned that Jane didn't want the baby to be baptized at their church because of unwanted attention. Who exactly would be paying them unwanted attention? We're not celebrities. The final straw was when Jane brought up the labor experience again out of nowhere. We were all sitting around at a family gathering, and someone asked how she was feeling postpartum. Jane went into this whole speech about how she barely even felt the contractions and how her body just knew what to do. She claimed the nurses were shocked at how calm she was and even said one of them called her a natural. My mom asked if she had used any pain relief, and Jane said she didn't need much because she zoned out through the whole thing. This directly contradicted John's previous story about how the birth was so hard that they decided to never have more kids. I asked John later, and he just said, "Yeah, it was tough, but we made it through." It felt like he was walking on eggshells, trying not to say too much. And then there's the baby. He's adorable, don't get me wrong, but something felt off. For starters, Jane refused to let anyone hold him for too long. She'd always say things like, "Oh, he gets fussy if he's passed around too much, or he only settles with me or John." I get that some moms are extra cautious, but even when Grandma wanted to hold him, Jane practically yanked him back after just a few minutes. A few weeks ago, Mom and I finally worked up the nerve to ask John if something was going on. We approached it carefully, saying we were just worried about Jane because she seemed distant and anxious. John absolutely flipped. He accused us of being unsupportive and said that Jane felt completely unwelcome around us. He even claimed we were the reason she didn't want to spend the pregnancy with our family. That one stung. Things got even more heated when John said Jane wanted an apology from me and Mom for doubting her experience. I told him we weren't doubting anything, just trying to understand. His response? You don't need to understand, just accept it. Mom thinks we should just drop it and give them space, but I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. There are too many unanswered questions, too many contradictions, and way too much secrecy for this to be normal. I mean, I've been around pregnant women before, and none of them acted this secretive, especially not with family. It's not like I'm accusing Jane of faking the whole thing, but at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a much bigger issue here that they're hiding. Maybe it's postpartum depression, maybe something happened during the pregnancy that they don't want to talk about, or maybe they just like their privacy to an extreme level. Whatever it is, I know one thing for sure, something isn't adding up, and I'm not crazy for noticing it. Mom and I have agreed to lay low for now, but the more I think about it, the more I realize we're probably not going to get any real answers. If Jane and John are hiding something, they're not about to come clean anytime soon. And if we push too hard, it might push John away for good. I don't know what to do next. Part of me wants to just let it go and pretend everything's fine, but another part of me feels like I need to keep paying attention, because if something is wrong, ignoring it won't make it go away. Update 2. Mom and I agreed to back off for a while, but honestly, that didn't make things any less strange. If anything, it just gave us more time to notice all the weird little things that didn't quite add up. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it nagged at me. And apparently, I wasn't the only one. A few weeks ago, my aunt pulled me aside during a family get-together and asked if I thought something was off about Jane's whole situation. She mentioned how Jane always seemed on edge, like she was expecting to be questioned about something. My aunt said every time she brought up the baby, Jane would quickly change the topic or brush it off with vague comments like, "Oh, he's growing so fast, it's hard to keep up." Then came the kicker. My aunt casually mentioned she had reached out to Jane's mom to congratulate her when the baby was born, and Jane's mom seemed weirdly uninformed about the birth details. She apparently said something like, "It was all such a blur, I didn't even make it to the hospital in time." Which, if true, would mean Jane wasn't even with her mom during labor like she originally claimed. Meanwhile, John has doubled down on the whole boundaries thing. Anytime someone brings up the pregnancy or birth, he just says, "That's in the past, let's focus on the present." He's even started getting a little snappy with people who ask too many questions. It's so unlike him, and it's making everyone uncomfortable. One of the strangest things happened when my cousin, who has a baby around the same age, asked Jane about her experience with postpartum recovery. Jane got this completely blank look on her face, like she didn't even know what my cousin was talking about. Then she said something about how she bounced back quickly and never really felt that different. My cousin, who struggled with postpartum issues herself, found it really odd. No complaints, no exhaustion, nothing. Just, it's been amazing, honestly. On top of that, Jane still refuses to share any baby photos unless they're super filtered or staged. Anytime someone asks to take a candid picture, she brushes it off with excuses about bad lighting or the baby being fussy. Even on social media, every picture looks like it came straight out of a baby magazine, all perfectly posed and edited to the point where the baby almost looks fake. It's bizarre. Then there's the whole umbilical cord thing. I still can't get over it. A friend of mine who's a nurse was over at our house the other day, and I brought it up casually, pretending I read it somewhere online. She just stared at me and said, "That's not possible unless there were major complications." But according to Jane, everything was perfectly fine with the baby. I also noticed that Jane avoids going anywhere in public with the baby. Every time we suggest a family outing, she has an excuse. Too busy, baby's schedule is off, not feeling well. But the weirdest one? She told my mom she didn't want to bring the baby to a family brunch because he doesn't like crowds. He's 4 months old. How would she even know that? And here's the wildest part. My mom ran into one of Jane's coworkers at the grocery store, and when she mentioned how exciting it must have been to work with Jane while she was pregnant, the coworker looked genuinely confused. She apparently said, "Oh, I had no idea Jane was pregnant until she went on leave." Which doesn't make sense because Jane made such a big deal about her cravings and pregnancy symptoms early on. How does your workplace not notice that? At this point, I feel like I'm in some kind of weird mystery novel where things just keep getting stranger the more you look into them. But what am I supposed to do? It's not like I can just come out and say, "Hey, is your pregnancy even real?" Mom and I have been going back and forth about whether we should just ask John directly, but we both know he'd get defensive and probably cut us off completely. And if by some chance everything is legit, we'd look like total jerks for even questioning it. Things took another turn when Jane made a comment about how she doesn't trust daycare because babies need their moms 24/7 to form a proper bond. Fair enough, right? But then she followed it up with, "That's why I never leave him alone for even a minute." Except, we know for a fact she left the baby with her mom for an entire weekend because John told us he took Jane on a surprise spa trip to help her decompress. So which is it? Even more red flags popped up when we noticed Jane gets super weird about baby milestones. Most moms are excited to share first smiles, first rolls, but when my cousin asked if the baby was starting to roll over yet, Jane kind of froze and then said, "Oh, not yet, but we're working on it." Working on it? It's not a skill you teach, it just happens. Then, last week, Jane showed up at a small family gathering without the baby. She claimed he was at home sleeping and that she didn't want to disrupt his schedule. When my mom suggested they call John to bring him over later, Jane shut it down so fast it was almost comical. She said, "He's probably out with the baby for a drive, you know how John is." Except, we don't know how John is, because this is the first time we've ever heard of him taking the baby out alone. Later that night, Mom called John just to check in, and guess what? He was at home, said the baby had been asleep all day, and acted like it was no big deal. But Jane specifically said they were out. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but the fact that every story has tiny little cracks that don't quite fit together is driving me insane. My friends think I should just let it go and stop obsessing over it, but how can I when every new detail just makes things seem even more suspicious? Mom and I decided to keep an eye on things, but at this point, I don't even know what we're looking for anymore. Then came the baby's first doctor visit fiasco. Jane mentioned taking him to a pediatrician for a routine checkup, and when Mom asked which doctor she was seeing, Jane fumbled for an answer before saying it was a private practice she found through a friend. Mom asked for the name, to maybe recommend it to another family friend, and Jane got all cagey and said, "Oh, they're super selective, I don't think they're taking new patients." It just felt off. At this point, I know confronting them won't get us anywhere, but the inconsistencies are too much to ignore. I can't tell if Jane is hiding something, if John is in on it, or if we're just dealing with some next-level privacy paranoia. Either way, something's not adding up, and I'm not letting it go just yet. Update 3. So, here we are. After months of confusion, suspicion, and feeling like I was slowly losing my mind, everything finally came to a head. And let me just say, I was not prepared for how it all unraveled. A couple of weeks ago, my mom had had enough of all the secrecy and weird excuses, so she decided to confront John. I told her it was a bad idea, that he'd just get defensive again, but she insisted. She called him up and said, point blank, "John, we love you, but something isn't right. We need to know what's going on with Jane and the baby." There was silence. Like, a long silence. Then John sighed and said, "Mom, I think we should talk in person." Mom and I drove over that evening, both of us on edge, expecting another round of vague deflections. But when we got there, Jane wasn't home, and John looked like he hadn't slept in days. He sat us down and, after a long pause, said, "I didn't know how to tell you guys because I knew you'd never look at Jane the same way again." And then, he dropped the bombshell. Jane never gave birth. I swear, I felt my brain short-circuit for a second. I just stared at him, waiting for him to say he was joking, but he wasn't. He told us Jane had a phantom pregnancy, also called pseudocyesis. It's a psychological condition where someone genuinely believes they're pregnant, experiencing all the symptoms, morning sickness, cravings, even a growing belly, but there's no actual baby. Jane had gone through several negative pregnancy tests but was so convinced she was pregnant that she refused to see a doctor until much later. When John finally convinced her to go, they found out there was no baby. By then, Jane was devastated and deep in denial, insisting the doctors were wrong. She even faked doctor appointments, convinced she could will the pregnancy into existence. John admitted that at first, he played along to keep her calm, hoping she'd eventually come to terms with it. But then she told everyone she was pregnant, and things spiraled out of control. He thought moving in with her mom would help, but instead, Jane doubled down, ordering maternity clothes, talking about the baby nonstop, even staging social media updates to keep up the illusion. When the due date got closer, Jane panicked. She didn't want anyone around because she knew she couldn't fake it forever. That's when she came up with the story about wanting privacy and an intimate birth experience. John, unsure what else to do, went along with it and told us to respect their boundaries. Then, the worst part, she announced the baby's arrival by adopting a newborn from an online agency that specialized in private adoptions. Apparently, Jane found them through some sketchy Facebook group. John said he tried to stop her, but Jane was completely convinced that this was her baby, the one she was meant to have. She forged hospital records, made up the birth story, and crafted this entire facade to keep up the illusion. He didn't know how to tell us the truth without breaking Jane completely. I sat there, trying to process it all, while my mom was in tears. It made so much sense, why there were no ultrasound pictures, why no one saw her during the pregnancy, the inconsistent stories, the bizarre medical claims. Everything suddenly clicked into place. I asked him where the baby actually came from, and he admitted they adopted him illegally through a private arrangement. The baby's birth mother was in a tough situation and needed to place him quickly, which made it easier for Jane to swoop in and take over. John said he had been trying to get Jane to see a therapist, but she refused, claiming that everything worked out the way it was supposed to. We asked him what he planned to do, and he said he was lost. He loved the baby, but he knew they couldn't keep living like this, pretending everything was normal. The next few days were a blur. Mom and I did a lot of talking, trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, Mom confronted Jane gently, offering support and encouraging her to seek professional help. Jane broke down, admitting she had been terrified that if she told the truth, everyone would judge her or try to take the baby away. She genuinely believed she had manifested the baby into her life and was scared of losing him. John finally convinced her to see a therapist, and thankfully, she agreed. She's been in therapy for a few weeks now, and while she's still struggling, she's starting to accept reality. They're working on legalizing the adoption and making sure everything is above board now, which is a huge relief. As for the rest of the family, we decided to keep the real story private. John told everyone Jane had some postpartum complications that made her withdrawn during the pregnancy, and now they're getting help and adjusting to parenthood. It's not the whole truth, but it's enough to keep people from asking too many questions. Honestly, I still don't know how to feel. I'm relieved we finally have answers, but I'm also heartbroken for Jane. What she went through mentally must have been terrifying. And John, for all his faults in enabling this, was stuck between a rock and a hard place. The baby, thankfully, is happy and healthy, and they're both taking steps to move forward. I just hope Jane can fully accept the truth one day and find peace with it. This has been the strangest, most exhausting chapter of my life, and I wouldn't wish this level of confusion on anyone. I'm trying to let it go now, focus on being there for my brother and his child, and hope that with time, things will settle into something more normal. So yeah, that's the end of this wild ride. If there's anything I've learned from this, it's that sometimes the truth is way more complicated than you could ever imagine.